Did we get to
like 3 people start? They haven't said anything on the opposite about where so. And there's nothing on it on this website at all. The people.
Oh, no. Made a mistake.
Isn't it supposed to be outside? What is it?
Everybody, I made a mistake.
That's it.
Act busy.
Oh, this can be very tough.
Oh, now you turn it in. After all I've been through.
It's all me. I didn't mark it. Because it's more. Last time.
I appreciate that.
I thought about it. I was like, well, we were last minute. We said. Like,
What'd you get on writing?
I didn't look.
AT&T.
I thought your brother asked me, and I didn't just talk about the writing.
He literally calls me. It's like, what'd you get on writing? It's like, the score is that? He goes, yeah, okay, just talk about it. What'd you get? I was like, do you want me to tell you right now? He goes, yes.
Did we get to, where did we finish? We get to this?
I think it was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, so what's next Thursday? The final. I reevaluated my final and I've decided to make it bigger. Not more questions, just big. One letter on each page. So you're just gonna get a stack like this. Now, number 2, we do have a final next week. What are you gonna need? Crayons. I want crayons. Who does not have crayons? See? First period was just, they didn't have them in our crayons. Can you believe that? That's right. This is the best class, arguably, ever. Not just I have, ever. And I am just saying. Okay. Well, I got fallout shelter candy. A high calorie treat. Who else wants 55-year-old sugar? Actually, it's older than that. It's 58-year-old sugar. Fallout shelter candy in your life. Guess what one you get? Red dye number 1. Oh. Hustle up. Burning daylight.
I'm sorry.
Maybe a little sweetener. Okay, so test next Thursday. Monday, I'll give you a hand on the short idea. You guys are going to do great house. Or else. So bring crayons and bribes. What kind of bribes do we need? That'll work. I just had raspberry Kit Kats. Someone gave me that from Japan. And it was amazing. Yeah. I'm a different person. I'm a different person. It really didn't have real raspberries. Now, wait a second. I could have had a shiv. I could have had a hatchet. You have to warn me. You never know.
Self-satisfied is a real threat.
Let's try it one more time. There we go. We're getting better at this. Someday, I still hope they take that room. Okay, so let's go and finish up a few things. I'll show you a few commercials from the 70s. Wow. So did we get to Martin Luther King being assassinated? I know, what a terrible segue.
Yeah.
Who killed Martin Luther King? Yeah, James Earl Ray. And then after Bobby Kennedy won, did we get to this?
We know that he died.
Yeah, so the primary didn't mean anything. This is the last election for Democrats where they were still choosing the nominee at the convention. So Robert Kennedy won the California primary, but he still had to win the majority of convention votes. The next election for Democrats, it would all come up to the states. For the Republicans, that would be the election of 76. That's coming up. Kennedy just won the California primary. So he had a little bit of momentum going into the nomination. LBJ dropped out of the race. And there he is on television at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, just giving like, I'm on to Chicago where the convention was, Big Three. He walked down, they kept him out the back room, down a hallway through the kitchen, and waiting for him was Sirhan Sirhan, who assassinated him. Yes, his name was Sirhan Sirhan. And he unloaded a revolver, basically walked towards him and fired. There were about 19 witnesses, saw this. Now, there are people today who will say it was part of a conspiracy. You can understand why that's weird, because 5 years earlier, his brother was assassinated. So it seemed like it was connected. Sirhan Sirhan was from a family of immigrants from Palestine, who the United States literally, just like overnight in the 1960s, was becoming more pro-Israel. They were not pro-Israel in the 1950s. Politics were changing. Here's Sirhan Sirhan being led away. And this was on television. Very late. It was, gosh, I want to say about 12:30 a.m. in Los Angeles. So it would have been 2:30 a.m. on the East Coast, or 3:30 a.m. on the East Coast. But here he is. He's still in jail today. And he was pretty unstable. And you notice one of the things, we have 3 names for the other assassins we've mentioned. I guess if you don't have 3 names, you go over just the same name twice. That's Sirhan. And this really, it just seemed to show that the country was in disarray. And Kennedy, there are good parts and bad parts about Kennedy, like anything else. I have mixed feelings about him, but overall, I admire certain elements of him. And when his train went back, the only reason I'm showing this is the train with the body, where he's going to be laid in state next to his brother at Arlington National Cemetery. Thousands of people came out and just spontaneously just say something, to be there. And these pictures, a photographer along, and he would eventually make a book about these photographs. And they're really quite touching. I get kind of choked up every time I see them. But all these people just came out. And it wasn't, yes, they missed Robert Kennedy, but it was this hopeful moment for many people. It seemed like this moment that America was making a change. And you will notice a difference after these assassinations that year. A lot more bitter, cynical, and that really hasn't gone away in a lot of ways. More divisive, and it makes me sad. Well, into the breach is going to step in. They literally called it the new Nixon. Nixon came rolling in, and the thing about Nixon was, we talked about Nixon before, mentioned him a number of times, but he'd been known as a hatchet man. Everyone thought his political career was done, but he was a tireless worker who never stopped trying to rally support, work his way into the, he'd go to local Republican dinners and the hell of it. Little dinners, just handshaking, making friends. I mean, smart politics, even though he was really kind of an introvert. That shows you how determined he was. And he had that ability to remember names. That's a big thing. You're a politician, you need to remember names. Or have somebody behind you with a little pad who has everyone's names and whispering into your ear. So I've met John Tester a few times. And I'll never forget, I was at this function. This is 7-8 years ago. I met him, and he forgot my name, which is fine. It's hard. You meet 1,000. You can imagine being a senator. By then, he was a senator, meeting thousands of people. But he said, "Hello, and you are again?" And I said, "Jay Partridge, is what you do." And the guy behind with a little pad, he wrote my name down. And the guy wrote it down. And I watched it afterwards. And he went to another person, and someone he thought he should know. The guy behind him. He whispers in his ear, and goes, "John, it's good to see you." I thought that was great. Let me tell you one story about a great memory for me. And this guy, one thing about being a college football coach, you're a politician. You go sell your school. It's not being a good coach, it's getting recruits. Here's my college trip. No. And so this is many years ago when I was in high school. I was at a football camp. And the University of Montana put it on, so I was, camp. And he was the brand new quarterback coach at the University of Montana, John Glenn. And he met everybody, just one of those things. They just go there, they do these to recruit. And so met him and stuff like that. And actually I went on a recruiting trip there, but I didn't even meet him at that time. But so he met me at this camp with like 150 other kids from eastern Montana. Almost 30 years later, I was at a football camp at the University of Montana. He was the head coach at the University of Montana. I was coaching. That's when I was coaching football. And he walked up to me out of the blue. And I'd not seen him I've talked to him in a really long time. And he walked up and he goes, "Hey, Jay, how you doing?" I didn't have a name tag. He remembered me from when I was in high school. That's almost scary. So, does anybody like that? Yeah, my name is Jay. Yes, my name is it's two birds. Get old. Okay. All right. So back to this. Nixon came back into politics, and this just started with Goldwater, but did the Southern strategy. And the Southern strategy, with protests in the street against the war, the civil rights movement, and the long hot summers, crime rates were going up. Crime rates went up really fast, 60s, 70s, and 80s. Thank you, Led. But all these things were going on. But also, it was very much anti-social or anti-civil rights. It was kind of code like civil rights. Law and order. I saw this someplace. It was the Law and Order Watch for the Nixon campaign. I'm just kind of fascinated by that. But really, they called them social issues. That society was getting too permissive, and traditional values were going away. And it's quite an effective campaign move. And the thought was to wean people who had been Democrats to vote Republican. And it worked at the national level. Democrats did incredibly well at all other levels, but for president, it worked really well. And there he is campaigning in the South, where the Democrat or the Republican Party had been a non-entity for the most part in the South since Reconstruction. And so it was quite effective, but he talked a lot about the forgotten Americans. By the way, here's the new Nixon. They're trying to make him up for being a hatchet man. It kind of worked and then would go away. But Americans who weren't protesting, those who went to work every day, those who their kids were drafted and they went, or they're the ones being drafted. They didn't try to get a deferment like go to college if you have a little bit of money, or get married in October, but that's another story. Or find a friendly doctor to say that you're ill. And try to find somebody. These are the forgotten Americans, and not the ones protesting in the streets. And it was an effective ploy in '68 when things seemed to be falling apart. And not completely, but it worked. Why did he move? Moving on. And the Democrats were in absolute disarray. The '68 convention, there's no clear front runner. Johnson's out of the race. Robert Kennedy is assassinated. And they thought 100,000 anti-war protesters were going to come. Only about 10,000 actually came. And here they are protesting. A lot of them actually, almost, 1 out of every 3 protesters was an agent provocateur hired by the FBI. Called Cohenthal. It was crazy. There were over 15,000 police, and to stop them, there were more police than protesters. And so while the Democrats were debating the war on the streets out in front, there were some protests. And this is looking outside the Hilton Hotel where the eventual nominee Hubert Humphrey would be. And the police attacked them. And this was being shown on TV. Eventually, this is going to be called a police riot. And the policemen waded in, furious, anger, and a lot was this social issues. They looked at these anti-war protesters, and they saw them as spoiled rich kids who got out of the draft while their kids were the ones being drafted, or they went and fought. And many of the police officers, we don't know exactly how many, but a lot, took off their badges, grabbed their day and night sticks, and waded in. Now, you probably know what a nightstick is. You know what a day stick is. Have I told you that one? Stick about that long. And they would keep they would keep them in locked cabinets on the streets. So those were days things. They were, they're obviously too long to carry around. And they waited in and beat them. And it was awful. The insults were all back and forth. Well, a couple things about this. First off, they showed this resentment. Nixon tapped into a real resentment. And secondly, the Democrats were just totally out of control. And they've never really recovered from this. Hubert Humphrey would get the nomination as vice president, but the problem is he's stuck with Lyndon Johnson in the war. He actually was against the war. An old-time New Deal liberal Democrat from Minnesota. He's against it. By the way, Hubert Horatio Humphrey, so you get the HQ, get it? HHH. Get it? Hubert Horatio Humphrey, HHH, HQ. That's math. And so the Democrats were split over the war, and a lot of people who agreed with everything Humphrey wanted the war, they were so mad at the war, they voted against Humphrey or didn't vote. And so everyone thought Humphrey was going to lose. Everybody. People would surround him and be chanting, "Dump the hump." There you go. And that, you really don't want that, campaign rallies. And the Democrats were split one more time. George Wallace, who I've mentioned before, you saw but he was the segregationist governor of Alabama. He jumped in. He was famous for trying to block school children from entering the schools. He said, "I will block them at the schoolhouse door." He came in much like 48 and Strom Thurmond, and he pushed law and order. States' rights wasn't the party, but it was segregation. If you want Wallace Country, Alabama, that's him and his wife. And that's him in 68 in San Francisco with the Confederate battle flag. But they're going to also win the war. But also he talked about, I'm going to bash those hippies and cut their hair, give them a bath and all. And really showed how divisive. In fact, everybody thought Nixon would win until, so Nixon didn't even run a campaign, just let the Democrats crush each other. But when Humphrey came out against the war, people started going back to Humphrey. And then Lyndon Johnson announced, maybe there's a peace agreement in Paris. Not at peace. There might be an agreement. We can pull out our troops. North Vietnam and South Vietnam have an election. We might have peace. And that's actually him at that conference table. This is after he dropped out. This Defense Secretary Clifford there, who was terrified that there might be peace in Vietnam. What person? Nixon. Panicked. This would only help Humphrey. So he conspired through a long chain of conversations to the president of South Vietnam, Nguyen Tu. Tu's right here. And Tu very publicly, a week before the election, walked out of the peace agreement, scuttling the peace agreement, meaning the war is going to go on for another 4 years. 24,000 more Americans and 1.5 more Vietnamese, 1.5 million more Vietnamese will die over the next 4 years. When peace would finally be settled in January 73, it would almost be identical to the peace agreement they walked out of. We know Nixon scuttled this for fact because J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, was illegally wiretapping the Nixon campaign. Oh, there's so many. He was also wiretapping the Humphrey campaign. I mean, it was kind of shocking, all the stuff that was going on. And since it was an illegal wiretap, and Humphrey said this was illegal, he wouldn't use it against Nixon, but he scuttled the peace agreement. And so the war would go on. They could have ended it there. And too long. That is why I despise Richard Nixon. Were you an assassin? That's what an assassin would say.
That's so scary. I mean, to a room and assassin.
That's why they never come back. Does your script went up? Sound good? All right. So it's hard to hide your biases. I know that, and I don't think it's impossible, but I really don't like Nixon. I should have. Most presidents of my lifetime I probably not have personally liked. But
you don't elect a buddy. They have a job to do, and you elect him for that. So I know I wouldn't have personally elected Nixon, and I don't like him. So it would be a razor thin election. And the combination of just sculling the peace agreement, Humphrey coming out late for the war, and Humphrey splitting those votes down here, Nixon would win. So Nixon was elected and would probably be the most divisive president since Lincoln. Now, Nixon will come in, vast Democratic majorities in the House and the Senate, but still a Republican president. And he's going to be buoyed by the fact, literally, months into his presidency, we landed on the moon. We all know it's not true, right? It's a massive conspiracy. We know it was all done on the soundstage, right? Ironically, the soundstage was on the moon. That was the hard part to get up there. But we do a unit in special topics where we go through the conspiracy theory. It's amazing how there's a lot of people at least claim to believe it. I wonder if they just claim to believe it and say, look at me. I believe something crazy. Well, yes, he landed on the moon. We didn't. Other people. I was around. Remember. I remember a lot of the moon like this big deal. Really, wow, that was really cool. But Nixon kind of could bask in the afterglow of that, as any president would, right? You know, yes, I'm president. I can go shake hands with the astronauts or look at them when they're in their isolation. They kept them in isolation for 3 days. Way down. But we got to get to the growing environmental movement at that time. Now, this is something that you have your review list or you read about already. So just to review this really quickly, 10 years before, Rachel Carson would write a book called Silent Spring. And do you remember John Muir? She's very much a descendant of John Muir. He was the one who had great influence on Teddy Roosevelt and national parks and this kind of maturing environmental movement. And the big thing she wrote about was pesticides, specifically DDT. And yes, it killed all the insects. But what was a silent spring referring to? Meaning silent as in what? Yeah, no more birds. Not just songbirds, all birds, but yeah, songbirds. Because what was DDT doing? Destroying the ants, which in essence kills the birds. And it almost did kill a number of, like, for example, a big vulture called the California condor that's almost extinct, and bald eagles are almost extinct. Almost all. And she wrote about this, saying the big thing about this one was, yes, Silent Spring is no songbirds, which. But think of the big thing is, we got to look at what people are doing to the environment and the long-term effects. It's not just DDT. It's going to be all these other things. And yes, because of the influence of this, this would eventually lead to the Clean Air Act that would ban DDT. There are some other pesticides out there. I mean, there's obviously very. We can start a roundup, but that's another story. Here's Rachel. But that would lead to a one Clean Air Act and one Clean Water Act. And in 1970, there was a push. We need a very strong agency to enforce environmental laws. Now, Nixon was opposed to this, but there were such overwhelming majorities in the House and the Senate, he agreed to the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA. And this would enforce laws. So through the executive branch, it would be part of the executive branch to enforce laws. Now, like any other executive branch, the executive is more pro-environment, which was a brand new phrase at that time. I remember first it was ecological, and then it turned into environmental. I just remember that switch. It's interesting. But if they're more pro-environmental laws, EPA is a little bit will enforce stronger. If they're anti-environmental laws, the opposite will happen, because that's one of the issues with environmental laws. We talked about that before. But there would eventually be 3 big clean air and 2 really big clean water acts. And the Clean Air Acts, we can really show a couple different things. At first, I had the polluted water on this is at Lake Michigan. The southern half of Lake Michigan by 1969 was covered with about 2 to 3 inches of foam on those. Nothing lived in it. It's gone now. Yes, there's still some issues on Lake Michigan, but it's gone. This is Lake Erie by Cleveland. Speaking of Cleveland, twice in the 1960s, the Cuyahoga River caught fire. If a river catches fire, that's a warning sign. And yeah, isn't that just amazing? That's a river. That's not like a slough. And look at, I like that from 68 to 2005. That's Los Angeles. And Los Angeles was famous for the smog. They get an inversion and the smog would just sit in there. Missoula was like that. Missoula was a lot worse back in the 70s. It was famous. Half the days of the winter, you could see. It's not like that now. When I went to graduate school there, it was kind of like that. And by 2005, Scott, what was the big cause of that? And one of the big things is by taking leaded gasoline out. That would change so much. Now, the EPA enforcement goes up and down. There's probably half as many inspectors now for the EPA as there was when I know there's half, as when I was in high school. So a lot of us now self-regulating. And all environmental laws are going to be up to the Supreme Court in about 2 weeks. So this is a big deal right now. But the big thing is nitrogen dioxide, but sulfur dioxide and carbon monoxide, but especially sulfur dioxide. In the late 70s, they started getting acid rain, where there'd be so much sulfur dioxide that the rain would have a little bit of acid in it. And no, it wouldn't be like this dripping hydrochloric acid, but it would kill grass, take away paint off the cars, be dangerous in drinking water. The big one is look at what happened to lead in the atmosphere. Lead's a really dangerous neurotoxin. And that went down dramatically because it took lead out of gasoline. And so people born after 1985 or so, especially in areas that don't have a lot of lead, aren't breathing in those neurotoxins. So you have a potentially greater brain function and also less violent. I was born with a lot of lead. Just letting you know. Yeah, that's why crime, probably one of the biggest reasons why crime rates dropped so much at the end of the 1990s. Coronavirus, everything went nuts. We'll see if the crime rates, but it's still nothing like it was. Speaking of that, toys made a revolutionary rebound in the 70s. Go back. Why isn't this sounding? Where's the sound on this? Somebody, thank you for this. What's the deal with this road? We got to work on this again. That's the second possible shiv I had in my back. You know what a shiv is? Oh. Let's see if this works. Why isn't this working? Oh, there's no sound.
There is sound. I can hear it. So I don't know.
I'm worried about turning everything up. I don't know what that is, but that could be the most dangerous toy I've ever seen. There's sound coming out. Look at that thing. It's a hard ball that you can like this around. Yeah, it broke noses. But this is what I was really looking forward to. They were still selling these in the 1960s. So I thought I'd show you this thing really fast. I thought that was great. Let's see one more. How loud is this going to be? Oh no, this is. So you tell me there's no coincidence between uranium kits and making monstrous robots that will take over the world. Who would have wanted that for? I would have. If I had that now, that would be kind of fun to just kind of drive into people's classes. So, one that we talked a little bit about this before the exam. I want to get a couple things about just build a little more context about the women's rights movement that was happening in this era. And the big thing that happened was, oh, let's see if we remember. What was the book? Yeah, Cult of Mississippi. Domicit. I can't even say that. Too much uranium. Okay, the Cult of Domesticity. And the mystique that women could be perfectly happy. In fact, that was kind of the role of this mystical role that women could be happy with what being their only choice for success. Marry and do what? Have children. Which nothing wrong with that. That wasn't the point. The point was that was the only choice. And if women did not do that. So that was the point. And so kind of coming out of the civil rights movement, bears up, you get this. Bro, but remember the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment guaranteed equal rights to persons and citizens. But they made it very clear in the debate. Persons and citizens meant what kind of persons and what kind of citizens. Huh? Actually, no, men. Because this was supposed to guarantee rights for former slaves, too. So men. It was not clear about women. Now, technically, they could say persons, but it's a gray area. And that's the point. Being a gray area that can be interpreted a number of different ways. Could it be determined upon your own personal ideology? So that's why it is not there. So the 14th Amendment guarantees people the rights under the Bill of Rights, but only guarantees men. Now, after Reconstruction, especially in the South with Jim Crow laws, that would be taken away for white, and also for actually people are not white, but also poor whites too. But that's another story. And then the Civil Rights Act of '64 said no discrimination based upon race, ethnicity, national origin, religion, or sex. That was meant to scuttle. Remember, I told you that story. So women have technically discrimination, even though how protection for discrimination, even though how do you enforce that? And it's not constitutional. And so it's still a gray area. And so the big thing about the women's rights movement was economic independence. They need legal and political protections for economic independence. Not to be solely independent, but if they had to, they could decide their own fate for themselves. Which is something that was just assumed that men could do, but not women. Remember, the job of women was to be, they called it a lot of time, the helpmate or the first mate for men by the 1950s. So, Title IX, do you remember that? We talked about this once before. Title IX said no discrimination in what? In what? Yeah, education. And that's where you get, actually it's pretty shocking what's happening there. When I was your age in school, but also nationwide in honors classes in high school, it was mostly still men. And now, nationwide, it is women, young women in honors classes in high school. But this is the one that always gets me, what happened in college. How college enrollment in 1950, there's significantly less women, and you can see it go up and up and up, and in the 90s began to pass, and today, there are significantly more women in college and significantly more college graduates, or women that are college graduates. And that is a big reversal. And that you can stand for Title IX. It also has, now the number of men have gone up, but actually the peak for men in college is here. Of course, why is the peak in men in college here? 1970. If you're in college, at least at first, you would not be drafted. So, college. And this, and all from 13% more women today Hispanic, 12% more women Black, 10% white, 9% for Asian. It's remarkable, that change. It's led to an interesting divide that between men and women. That's another story. But the other big issue about economic independence family planning, we've talked about this once before. There's no probably bigger issue than birth control. But the big thing is, I'm going to have this out of order. This is the big one. This is from a 2012 Michigan study, but you can find innumerable studies. Now take the absolute numbers with a grain of salt. Depends on your methodology and things like that. But the conclusion is very clear. For women, economically, when they have a child, their income drops dramatically. 30% drop in income when women have a child. Also, lower hours worked, lower participation in work, and actually lower wages once they have a child. And the reason why is women still to this day are the primary caregivers for children. And so it's a big issue about that. Let's think about have children and get a plan. This is not 1800 when everybody was on a farm. And now you have jobs, especially when you first get started. You might have limited income, you might have debts to pay. It's deciding when you have children. And that's the big issue. That's why for women's rights, family planning is such economics. That's a big drop in wages. And we see that today. This is the reason why women make about, it depends on what you see, 75 to 80% what men make from jobs. And it goes back to partially hourly wage or hours they can work and this. So that's why if women are ever going to be able to decide for themselves, they need that independence. That's why it was such a big deal. Of course, this will come up to issues, but I want to show you that. And don't forget this court case, Gridwald versus Connecticut. There's the one that said that there's a constitutional right under the 14th Amendment to the right. That meant, for example, birth control that is a decision by women based upon their right to that. And the reason I'm mentioning this is in the draft about the ruling that's probably going to overturn Roe versus Wade, which I'll talk about in a second, that is specifically mentioned being unconstitutional, being thrown out. So that could happen because there's going to be a whole series of laws and states banning certain forms of birth control. So there will be a case. So this is going to be it's going to happen maybe before you graduate from high school. So this is a big deal. Wow, is this going to be a big deal? Yeah.
Is it like,
I don't know, but it will come up to a court case. And there are going to be states that are ruling. And so I don't know. So we go to a court case about the gambling ban. Things are going to be significant.
so how is the right to privacy and how is that like the option, I guess?
Well, they would say that the right to privacy, birth control is not privacy. Well, I'd say we'll get to interpretation. But yeah, the argument would be this comes from it's called the Glucksman. But they, Has anyone heard of the Glucksman doctrine? You're not alone. But there's a court case that said that there's not everything was listed in the 14th Amendment. You know, it doesn't say all these rights. And so it doesn't say certain rights of privacy or things aren't even listed. And so what the Glucksman doctrine says is that some things of the 14th Amendment, if it's kind of part of the American tradition, the legal tradition, even if it isn't mentioned, is still protected by the 14th. So that's what it is. Because there were no birth control pills. And so that, it depends where you want to turn. And I'm trying, trying to, because I don't know what's going to happen. All I know is things are going to be a lot different in 2 years. Montana has a state constitution, a constitutional right to privacy. Constitutional right in the state of Montana. So they'd have to overturn our constitution or change it. Fairly good. So Roe versus Wade, that's the same. Why was Roe versus Wade founded? Because of Griswold. That's wrong. So when Roe versus Wade is probably overturned this summer, that's why I mentioned Griswold. That's why. And this was abortions, legal and safe. But the thing I had to mention, trimesters. Have you ever heard of trimesters for pregnancy? That was kind of invented in Roe versus Wade. They said there's a right to privacy, but they really tried to get into, okay, when's the right time? When is abortion should be legal and safe? And when do we start looking at literally either the life of the mother, the life of the fetus becomes dominant? And they divided up into threes. They did it for the crits. So every trimester, this is from Roe versus Wade. First 3 months, it said there could be no limits on abortion. The second 3 months, there can be few when it comes to safety and health of the woman. The last 3 months, there can be severe restrictions or no abortion, depending on state law. That's what Roe versus Wade was. So they divvied it up. The problem with that is it's really confusing. Warren Burger, the Chief Justice, voted with the majority, and he thought he was voting against abortion. So it's really complex. That was the compromise. So it does not give all abortion legal. It divides it. That's why many states have different restrictions. But that's going to be thrown out, so it's going to go to the states. And you've probably heard pro-life versus pro-choice. No one even thought about that. The majority of the population was for it. By polls, more Republicans than Democrats wanted it. In fact, the only major Christian denomination opposed to abortion were Catholics. And that's interesting. Southern Baptists now like 90% abortion. They were for abortion. And all this is going to flop in the 1970s. I mean, it's just like this dramatic change where it will also become an issue. I was alive, I can remember this, but the late 70s will become very divisive. So that's when, as many Republicans or more Democrats are actually against it, but Republicans in the late 80s or late 70s, they went out, not all, but started going against abortion. That became part of the social issue. Yeah.
So was there ever a switch? Which one? Have a discussion more about the.
There was a lot of our people that were against birth control pills who thought it ruined traditional family values. But so there's a lot of that kind of cultural argument against it. But once abortion came, abortion superseded the pill and other birth. But as soon as just in the last 2 weeks, you've seen a lot. So once again, we'll see. It's kind of amazing how all this stuff happened. Ironically, the day this court ruling was listed, Lyndon Johnson passed away. The most amazing president, good and bad, to ever inhabit the White House. How about that? An inmate of the White House would die that same day. So one more thing we have to get to, the Equal Rights Amendment. So the Equal Rights Amendment would be fought for since the 19th Amendment giving the right to vote. And this simple amendment. No discrimination based upon sex. That's all it said. Montana has this in its state constitution. that is explicitly written in Montana State Constitution that was done about 50 years ago. Explicitly written. So it went to the states. President Nixon was for it, President Ford was for it, President Carter was for it. Both political parties were for it. And they passed, went through 35 states right away. It looked like it's going to get to 38 necessary. Remember, it needs 3/4 of the states. Looks like it is a done deal. And then it just froze. And this became a massive fight. Well, everyone just assumed it was going to happen. And the law said a 10-year window. So here's protests for it. And there was a backlash almost immediately that this is going to take away the traditional role of women, meaning the cult of the word I couldn't say. Domesticity. Remember, the cult of domesticity is the cult. It's not that old. But a lot of women, this is Phyllis Schlafly, who had become one of the most powerful conservative advocates in America, pretty remarkable person, would tirelessly fight against equal rights, which is kind of interesting because she showed that men and women have incredibly equal power to do amazing things. But one of the big issues was, well, first off, I said this would destroy marriages. If women had equal rights, they would just abandon the marriage, which it might mean that it might be easier for women to leave abusive or horrible marriages or vice versa. But that's that women, only reason they're being married is because that is a traditional role that we thrown out, so women will be out on their own. And also bathrooms. That was a big one. I can't even begin to tell you what a big deal bathrooms were. The idea was, okay, once you have no discrimination based on sex, public restrooms will no longer be men and women. They'll just be bathrooms. And you'll have, you see the rapists, but like, and I remember seeing a picture, and I can't find it, but it's a poster against the ERA, and it had a little girl going to the restroom and with like a biker gang. And I really wish I could find that one. It's so personified that. But you see bathroom arguments go on to this day when people are drenching, things like that. So this is a pretty common thing, but it's saying that. So there'll be men and women in bathrooms together. And as we all know, if that happens with public restrooms, there will be anarchy and society will break down. Why am I so obviously being facetious? Are there places in, let's throw a state out, Montana, that have unique sex bathrooms? Has society broken down? I just saw dogs running around the hallway. Society has come undone. Did it work? Yeah. And so a lot of men were like, even women can't decide if they want. And they would use terms that are just very derogatory terms. It's just a cat fight, and what do men care? But there's another thing. A lot of women who work really hard jobs, most jobs are hard and painful, not enjoyable. And they finally got out of those awful jobs when they got married and have children. And they were they thought being shamed to say, well, you should go out and get a job and have a career being for equality. And this really was an issue. Like, I finally got out of this horrible job. You're saying I have to go back to that horrible job? I know people like that, who I like very much and understand and sympathize. And they felt, don't shame me into this. And so it didn't pass. It never passed. Would it pass today? Not a chance. Wouldn't even get a vote in the Senate. Wouldn't even get a vote. So women, technically women have equal rights, but it's still a gray area. So while that's going on, a couple things really quick. By the way, the biggest anti-war protests of the entire war took place in 1969. No one saw because they were hidden in this valley. Millions came out, called the Anti-War Moratorium. And the anti-war protests, it was a real cross-section of people. A lot of young people, I think, for obvious reasons, but older people from all classes, all walks of life. And this absolutely terrified Nixon, who won a razor-thin minority in the House in this, or razor-thin minority in the Electoral College. See you tomorrow. And so Nixon began a strategy to try to marginalize the war and make it look like he's winning the war. His strategy, the first thing, marginalize the anti-war movement, make them look like traitors, make them look like a bunch of drug-addled hippies that aren't real Americans, and get back to that forgotten American thing. And it was quite effective. I can't begin to tell you how many people have told me about Vietnam veterans being attacked by anti-war protesters. And they were spit on and all this, things like that. And I'm not talking about what individuals do, because individuals can be jerks. But there's no film of this. There's no pictures of this that exist. There's no contemporary stories about this happening, about veterans coming home being spit upon. I remember a guy telling me, and great guy, when his ship was coming into Oakland, coming to Oakland, we're naval base there, and they're coming under the Golden Gate Bridge. He told me that 1,000 hippies lined up on the Golden Gate Bridge and urinated on their ship. And I said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "Did they really?" "Oh yeah." I said, "You saw them?" He goes, "Well, I was below the deck." And then again, and no one took a picture of this. Nobody filmed this. No. If you tell, it's amazing what you can convince yourself happened. And people say this to this day. By the way, what happened to Vietnam? That's even, I think, a bigger tragedy. They were ignored. Just ignored. Like nothing happened. And expected to come back in society. That's disgusting. So, a few highlights of the 70s. Oh, tomorrow's stories. Highlights of the 70s on Monday. Highlights of the 80s on Tuesday. Highlights of the 90s and the 2000 on Wednesday. And tests.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Did you like the ads?
Yeah.
I'm really sad the swing game one didn't work. We'll see you tomorrow. The Rolling Stones.
My grandfather taught
He what? Oh, so he was on, was he Navy or Air Force? Was he on? Was he in country? That's what they call it. Vietnam, or was he like Thailand?
We need past names.
Yeah, basically, we also.
They just put it about one thing. Yeah.
So I caused that. So I found this great commercial, and the sound doesn't come in. I'm so sad. That was really sincere. I saw, bummer. You've just marginalized my existence. And that's about, yeah. What are you going to do about it? Well, I'm not going to help you pick that up. Yeah. Did we get to this? 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 Oh, we're behind. We got to go.
Did you vote for me?
Let me show you.